My name's Trevor Griffiths. I founded the Emotional Logic Centre in 2003, developed this a way to understand emotions that was intended to prevent mental illness and relationship breakdowns. It's been very successful over the last 20 years. It's gone internationally. And I'd like to give you an introduction to the background theory behind why it works. So this is more a theoretical level. This would lead the way to having conversations with your questions and answers as a result of seeing all of this. So I'm looking for a bit of dialogue feedback and discussion. It's intended to be a stimulating set of ideas. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint. And we should be able to get the slideshow running. Here we go. So this is about a new theory of change, because although I set out to prevent mental illness, we've discovered along the way with the growing awareness of traumatization that in fact this theory of change behind emotional logic can promote post-traumatic growth. And the emotional logic method maps how a healthy adjustment process to change can get twisted into unhealthy patterns of stuckness. Now, it is a lifelong learning method. It's not a therapy. And that's why I started off with the Kolb learning cycle, which is absolutely foundational to the way it works, the way we train coaches who work one-to-one with people, the way we train trainers who will be running courses. The Kolb cycle starts off with the experience of what's been happening, and then we move into reflection. And that's where I'm going to be starting this little presentation of the background theory, a little bit of reflection on what's been going on over the last decades and how we've ended up at this place where emotional logic as a lifelong learning method can promote personal development and encourage the recovery from traumatization. So a bit of reflection, then a fair bit about abstract conceptualization. What is emotional logic as a method of healthy adjustment and personal development? A little bit of then planning, the active experimentation, the pragmatism of what the method can achieve and why, and then what is the results of actually using it. Just a brief presentation of some findings. So starting off with the reflection, first of all, Enlightenment science, 300 years of development of studying the natural world in increasing detail, smaller and smaller scales, but also astronomically, universal, cosmological pictures of the world have developed enormously over this time. But there was a scientific method that started out, which basically the scientists adopted an observer status looking on reality, and that makes a dualist assumption. The scientists exerted control over environmental variables so as to isolate one factor to study, and other factors from the environment that break through this are called random influences. So there's an idea of randomization in the background. A linear view of time is part of the Enlightenment science method, that time only moves from past to the future, which leaves out final causes. A positivist view of particulate matter as measurable is a truth criterion in science. It has to be repeatable and measurable by different people in order to assume that we're actually studying reality here. And measuring of change as cause-effect connection is the Enlightenment science is looking for connections, proving connections between one cause and effect in a linear time frame. And that, in the area of psychology as it develops within this Enlightenment science approach, led to a stimulus-response behaviorist view of reality. And emotion has fitted into that. The initial work on emotion was very much the stimulus-response concept of what's going on there. But sorry, this took a little time there. So since the 1980s, there has been a new science. It developed at that time, particularly from the development of supercomputers that could do multiple number crunching all at the same time. And that led to the discovery of order emerging within chaotic systems. So the idea of systems of networking communications could now be studied and measured and modeled. Now, following on from the 1980s development of this new science into more recent decades, the cosmological quantum gravity understanding of matter and information behind matter has led to a totally new view, which is significant for where emotional logic fits into the scheme of things. Because now the scientist does not have to be just an observer. There's a non-dual participator status of the scientist. And they're participating in a complex dynamic reality. Everything is on the move. Everything is actually interconnected. What we're looking at is how do we focus our attention on significant connections that are relevant to our lives? We're selecting out of this dynamic reality something that we concretize. So dynamic adaptive systems have feedback learning, and that's the conversational model of the new science that emotional logic is part of. And these conversational feedback dynamics, the mutuality of informational flow, shapes material life. So you can look at it in terms of people's houses, their gardens, the farming of environments, and so on. All of these are material changes that come about because of conversational learning. Now, timeframes in this new science allow for final causes. It's not just linear time. We're looking at a time frame. We focus our attention. Are we looking at the next 5 minutes or the 20 minutes of this presentation? Are we looking at the next week? Are we looking at a lifetime impact? What is the purpose that we have that's creating this story, this narrative that is on the go within the time frame? So purpose, teleology, comes back in, not just as linear cause and effect from past to future, but there is a wider time frame, and we can be selective about the time frames, and that changes our view of what's significant in reality. So system transformations, systems get into states, and the state is deterministic. It is actually causally affecting what happens, but it's complex, and therefore its outcomes can be modeled, but they're probabilistic. They're unpredictable to a certain extent. You can model it changing features to see what the impact is, but you're exploring that in a modeling state. So this is the new science, where we're participating in a dynamic reality and modeling potential changes that we are contributing to. Now, let's have a look at the development of psychology in this, not to spend long on this. This is all just part of our sort of reflective introduction. So back in the 1950s, we had the origin of behaviorism, which was in the old science model, in the Enlightenment science model. Skinner, Pavlov, and Furster, and so on. Thomas Kuhn, 1962, paradigm shifts in scientific constructs. The scientific revolutions can change the way we look at reality, and that changes what we think reality is, opens up different sorts of experimental findings that we need to integrate. Konrad Lorenz, 1963, chaos theory and butterfly effects, that early on. But the chaos theory and the complex adaptive systems has developed in the decades since and become the dominant way of looking on reality and informational processing within reality, rather than the positivist idea of particles as solid lumps that bounce around with momentum. A very significant shift of paradigm in our thinking. And within that, NISO developed cognitive psychology, 1967, Gibson and Barker, ecological psychology, the idea that human beings are actually earthed, that's their embodiment is important, 1970. Milan systemic family therapy developed with Palazzoli, 1971. All of these decades, fantastic pace of development of a shifting paradigm away from linear cause and effect of material systems into systems interaction and change of states from one state to another. So the systemic psychology that was introduced in the 1970s introduces also a social constructivist view of reality. It's not only material causes. Material causes and relational connection are complementary to each other. They're impacting each other. And we're part of that. We're in it. We're participators relationally in that process. When we set up experiments, we're actually altering the material world with our relational intentions. Emotional logic is actually based in ecological psychology. It emphasizes the embodiment of a human being in the environment, and there is an informational feedback, which we know as emotion, we experience it as emotion, which is giving us vital information for adaptive life in social environmental settings. Yeah, so that is more the context. I want to give you that idea of ecological view of the human being, of the person, is the context for emotional logic's view of emotion. So now we're into, let's look at this in more detail. This is the theory part of that Kolb cycle. So mind shift about emotion. We're actually suggesting, because of the medical background of emotional logic, we tend to think very physically about emotions, and then secondarily, cognitively, about the feelings of emotion. They're different, actually, obviously related, but they are different. Now, all of grief's unpleasant emotions, we are saying, have useful purposes to move adjustments. That is quite a significant shift, because a lot of people talk about negative emotion and just need to get rid of it. And we're saying, no, these emotions carry vital information about our values, and we need to actually understand what that information is telling us in order to make proper adjustments. We're also saying grieving is one integrated process of adaptation with several interconnected emotions. There are different schemes for describing this. We use a 7 stepping stone model, which we'll come on to. But basically, we're saying grief is not one emotion amongst others. It is a process of adaptation and adjustment, which can lead to learning and the development of the human personality. We're saying emotions are physical preparations for action in a situation or reflective withdrawal. They move us towards or away from situations. They're not in the mind. They are embodiment. They're happening at a reflex level, but a values level we'll come on to, pre-verbally, before the awareness of this comes up into the cortex. And fourth point is that emotions are sending out social messages that are communicating our personal values from deep in the core of the brain, which is where we're saying they are located in the limbic system and core brain, thalamocortical cycles and feedback cycles and so on. But emotions are the facial expressions, the tone of voice, the body posture, the pheromones in our perspiration that connect people together, and also animal life as well. We're aware of the emotions that a dog is experiencing, and that can adjust the way we're responding to this. So emotions are genetically inbuilt, vital communication systems between people, pre-verbally communicating what is valuable to the different living organisms. Now, we put these all together into what we call a life cycle diagram. This is not from birth to death. This is happening moment upon moment, multiple times during any day. There is a cycle. And it's about viewing our connection into this dynamic wholeness as love, as a core creative connection. Values are what you love. Of course, there's who you love as well, but they all have different multiple aspects of what it is that we value about this relational dynamic that's going on. When the relationships are working well, there's a joy. Love is known as with the joy. But the trouble is that because we're all different, there'll always be some point of disappointment or setback or hurt. Some sort of misunderstanding happens. And then suddenly the joy collapses into shock, where I'm doubting my resources to handle what's going on. I don't know what is going on. And then that shock can lead on to these various other grief emotions, all of which have useful purposes to move us in different ways, to explore what's going on and what we can do about it in order to reconnect with our values and with others in life. And we're saying that there are two growth points within the loss reaction, the inbuilt genetic loss reaction, where you're exploring new potential. So you move from shock where I doubt my resources to growth points where I discover new resources and develop new ways to adapt and reconnect with what's important. And that completes the cycle. So love is made known both in two modes. It's the joy mode when things are going well, and that's quite still and, obviously pleasant. But it also, love is it moves into a grief mode, which is purposely dynamic and unpleasant in order to move us to explore. That's the key thing about the emotional logic method. We're actually saying all of these unpleasant emotions are genetically inbuilt for survival and thriving in order to move us. We're not supposed to just stay with them. That's a very significant difference from what's being taught about mindfulness in some settings. And so, we are aware of these interface issues with them. The bottom right-hand corner here, it says messy whirlpools of turbulent loss emotions. We'll come back onto that. But that is a major discovery of emotional logic. That is a new, theory of change, a new cause of mental illnesses and relationship disruption through overwhelming complex grieving. Now, particularly in America, the work of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross still has a very dominant hold on the sort of the prevailing narrative about emotions. But unfortunately, I believe that her pioneering work, which I really genuinely honor for what she did, 1969, that book on death and dying, was transformative in people understanding human dynamics. But the science has moved on from there. And unfortunately, the popular psychology has not moved on to keep pace with it. Now, emotional logic is meant to try and facilitate that process of moving on to a more constructive way of understanding the emotional experience of loss. Now, when Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was working, she basically interviewed people with a terminal illness diagnosis. And her work describing 5 stages as sort of a linear process has been subsequently generalized into a popular psychology. First of all, it generalized into a bereavement model for relatives and friends, at which when you're facing a terminal illness, or maybe even in bereavement, acceptance might seem to be a reasonable endpoint of the process. But actually, this model, the 5-stage model, has also been generalized further into a general approach to emotional intelligence, especially in business settings and motivation settings, that just understanding each other's dynamics in terms of these 5 stages is often considered adequate as a way of understanding how to modify my relationships. And unfortunately, the idea that things have to reach acceptance before the process is finished changes with emotional logic, because both bargaining and acceptance actually are reasonable endpoints in the emotional logic process. Now, the Kubler-Ross linear view of emotional stimulus response adjustment to loss promotes a sense of passivity about accepting this linear process, rather than the emotional logic approach, which is moving you into an activity to come through stronger by personal relational growth. Yeah. Now, this has most recently, Stephen Joseph in 2011 brought out his book, What Doesn't Kill Us Makes Us Stronger, basically. And he is describing post-traumatic growth, which, of course, there's a growing literature now on the idea that 30 to 70% of people come through traumatizing times stronger. Now, emotional logic provides the rationale as to how people can come through stronger through difficult times, because the loss reaction, the genetic loss reaction, has built into it those growth points where we're exploring new ways through. How we can access that is what we're moving on to, making it practical. Now, we use a 7-step model, not the 5, and Kubler-Ross did not recognize shock in the process and guilt and culture. People in psychology, particularly in America again, basically don't do shock and don't do guilt. They're very driven to be outwardly going. But both of those have vital roles to make us look inwards to work out what our resources are to better handle the situation, or maybe move on to the growth cycle to actually develop some new resources if we're not well placed to handle it. So that internal reflective feature of emotional processing to loss isn't heavily represented in the generalized version of Kubler-Ross applied for motivational work and relational intelligence. Now, we've developed online card pattern development. This is a screenshot from the way people lay out. When we ask them to discuss a situation, how do you feel? You'd be amazed at how many emotions people feel. Even those who've got what you might look on as being fairly simple, well-ordered lives actually can have a very rich internal emotional world. And paradoxically, otherwise, some people who you might imagine are very outgoing, in fact, have a very limited range. We can map this. And over the years, 20 years of doing this, we've learned to see various patterns in it that we can now associate with behaviors that get diagnosed as common mental illnesses and the predisposition to disruptive relationships. And by learning how these emotions fit together, we can help people to move on to personal development. Now, the method does depend on saying that emotions are physiology. They're our body chemistry getting organized to gear us up to either go out into the world or step back. And the Antonio Damasio, who work on emotion processing, found that the sensations of emotional processing in our bodies come up into the brain, into certain areas of the brain to be processed, which he called somatic markers of emotion. And they then integrate with our memories and the general meaning that we attribute to things. And that's what gives these somatic markers a feeling. And that feeling of emotion that we will experience cognitively actually is unique because it's shaped by our memories and our past experiences. Now, that means that our physiology, the genetic, physiological, physical emotions communicate correctly with people what our values are. They connect people. But when we talk about our feelings, actually, we may find ourselves separated from people because our feelings are unique to us and they may misunderstand them and misinterpret them. And we may not have the right sort of relationship that you can inquire further about them. That's where emotional logic comes in. We develop a skill set and a mental framework to go through behind naming feelings into naming the values, naming what's important via naming what's lost, because you only know what you've lost by experiencing loss emotions. You only know what your values are when you see a risk you might lose them. It's those loss emotions that are giving you vital information about what's important in life or what's important in somebody else's life. So we use both the emotions, these orange cards, what we call the backbone of adjusting, and then the feelings scatter around that. But the feelings map where your energy is, because that's where we're tied up cognitively in making a framework and making a meaning about all of this. Now, behind those patterns, that was a picture of emotional chaos, overload. There were pattern features in that pattern which we know will trap somebody and make them feel quite distressed and confused. But behind it, there is a logical process, emotional logic. And these arrows show what that logic refers to. It is the process of adjustment. In this situation that I'm facing, can I recognize what I'm afraid I might lose? If I can name it, can I prevent the loss of it? If I can't, if it's gone, can I get it back? If I can't, if I failed, then what does life look like if I've got to let go of it? That's a logical process, isn't it? Yeah, but we don't do it. We don't do it like that. But nevertheless, to know that logical process can help us to, hey, let's put a pause in here, a pause for reflection, and work out what's going on. Usually, most people knee-jerk react to prevent loss. Yeah, but emotional logic guides them back to recognizing loss and building an action plan for having done that. Now, the emotions that come along with this sort of process of adjusting can either drive us out into the world, to the ocean change the world around you to prevent loss or recover loss, or the urge to change the person you are inside. Those are two different dynamics. And each of those has an emotional state associated with it. And this is how we map them onto this healthy adjustment process in pairs, where shock and denial have different roles. Denial, I'm going to ignore this and carry on out in the world, even though I know something troubling is happening. All of these have useful purposes. And this is the full diagram that we use as our core diagram of the healthy adjustment process. There's more behind it than we can say. We're not going to go into this now, but this is just showing you how we build up a picture of the useful purposes of these emotional states to energize our moving through this logical process. If we know that there is this process, when it gets all jumbled up through overload and being caught up in the dynamics of a situation, we can have a pause for thought. Shock tells you to stop what you're doing, find a safe place where you can review your resources. That's one of the key bits of teaching that we have. That guilty self-questioning stage drives us to learn what else we could do. Without being able to go to that self-questioning, we'll never learn. We just keep on doing the same old thing and getting the same things that we've always got. And that, if it leads to confrontation, will lead to confrontation again. We also divide these 7 stepping stones up into 2 parts. The first part, if it rumbles around between, I can't recognize loss, I want to prevent something, but I don't know what it is, that builds up into stress. The second half, those 3, and this is the curious bit, it includes the depressive emptiness, make the growth cycle. And we'll come on to that. But the depressive emptiness, we completely reframe, not as a sign of weakness or problem or come to our limits. But when you've learned how to name losses and reinterpret them as values, that place of depressive emptiness is actually a place of decision for that value. Am I going to go back to try some bargaining to get it back, or am I going to let it go? Sometimes that can be a very difficult decision. So people can get stuck there. But the emptiness is not in itself a problem. It's not clinical depression. This is an existential state. And we actually have something constructive to say about every one of these, which liberates people to help them stop being self-critical. Now, behind all of these emotions, right, there are lots of losses of things that we value. We use this loss reaction worksheet, which is a powerhouse for change. And this is a mock-up sheet for somebody who's been made redundant, who's lost their job at work, which means they also find their pride is challenged, their ability to meet friends on a regular basis, they've lost routine and a reason to get up in the morning, lost the wife's respect and lost money from it, and then we get people to say, right at this moment, when you think about this aspect or that aspect, some of which might relate to things that happened a long time ago that have been jiggled up again by this situation. But right at this moment, what do you feel about that loss? So I'm feeling shocked and angry about the loss of the job. I'm feeling angry and guilty about not meeting my friends. I wonder if I could have done something different to keep the job. So then by mapping these, this is a totally unique tool. This is like an X-ray or a reconnaissance photograph into someone's inner heart, into their soul, if you like, showing what the tensioning of their physiology and their thoughts and their cognitive frame is whenever they remember this situation. Pow, all of that comes out at the same time. It is not a simple linear processing. It's a pattern recognition system. And these patterns can evolve one into the other. And they can evolve one into the other most successfully in conversational settings, when people are getting constructive feedback from emotionally available others who can understand what's going on, who can affirm the value of each of these unpleasant emotions, who can help someone to name the losses and reinterpret them as values. Because although this is a list of hidden losses, we say to this person, but you'd only name these as losses if they're things you valued. So this is a list of your values. This is who you are. This is your personality, your identity as a person, right? This is why you knee-jerk react in the world, and people know you as what's important about life. So when people see this, their self-respect rapidly turns around, usually, from being somebody who's overwhelmed with loss, a victim of their circumstances, to suddenly recognizing, no, I'm a person with values. If I've got values, I'm a person of value. My decisions, my actions count. They're significant. We see major changes, butterfly effect changes in people's sense of identity and capacity in situations by mapping the values, their personal values, that are driving the emotional world, which might get into a complex state. But by naming the values, you can now make a values-based action plan to recover or preserve one value in the future, naming the value so you can build a relationship that understands why you're doing what you're doing. So the whole of life takes on a more clarified order. The social order improves at the same time as your inner emotional order and self-understanding, self-awareness. But when people are overwhelmed, you might have noticed there were two columns there that were filled in. You might have remembered on the card pattern, anger and shock were overlapping. That's what we call a whirlpool of emotion. And over the 20 years that we've been doing this, thousands of people in all cultures, all 5 continents of the world, we've been doing this. We find the coaches that I've trained find exactly the same thing. Where certain emotions tie up. So when I feel shocked, I also feel angry. When I feel angry, I also feel shocked. I'm angry, I'm shocked, I'm angry. The body chemistry can't keep up with it. And the brain can't organize a response as fast as all of that chemistry is buzzing around. So people get confused. But I wanted to show you these because there are 7 common whirlpools that we teach. In fact, we're finding more all the time. And we discuss these amongst our follow-up sort of sessions with coaches. But the common ones are anger and guilt together are what you find people with compulsive behaviors, self-harming behavior, eating disorders. They drive people to take action. The anger drives action when people are actually feeling there's something wrong with them inside, but it gets irrational. But the really important one is that anger and depression tied up together create a drive to smash it up, break up this situation. I can't cope with this. Destructive drives, and if it's turned inwards, suicidal thoughts and confrontational behavior. Now, that means that we actually differentiate self-harming behavior from suicidal thoughts, which the International Classification of Disease does not do. They says there are different degrees along the same scale. Well, I'm sorry, we say no. They actually have different whirlpool effects on the body chemistry, and when you look at the loss lists, right, that go on between them, the strategy that you'll have to help somebody break out of that whirlpool will be unique to their values, not to their life circumstances, to what's important of them. But the whirlpool can be the common feature. This is the cause, the new cause. And this is what opens the way to a new theory of change. People who are traumatized will have lots of these whirlpools going on, swirling around inside them, and will gradually bring people to an acknowledgement that they can actually harness the underlying inbuilt genetic loss reaction as a healthy adaptability process. These are the list of common whirlpools we have. We're not going to dwell on this. Just wanted to show you destructive behavior, post-traumatic stress disorder, inside that denial card. What is packed inside there? Several other whirlpools will be packed inside there. Feeling odd and out of it, depersonalization, low self-regard, guilt, depression is the start of clinical depressions. The shock whirlpools are a type of anxiety states, shock and depression, fatigue. All of these have been found empirically by doing these card patterns and the emotional method, lifelong learning method, with people who've got these problems and finding these common themes. So we're going to bring this more to an end now, looking at the actual emotional method. But this is what we actually have found on working with people, and it's become a theory of physiological overwhelm with cognitive overwhelm that can be altered by feedback learning about the healthy adjustment process. Clinical depression is where you get lots of accumulating whirlpools, all including the depressive emptiness. And when the depression gets pulled into a whirlpool, it gets sucked out of the growth cycle and completely disempowers the growth cycle, so people cannot explore possible solutions. But by learning the correct or the helpful place of depression the emptiness and powerlessness of the depression of loss as a place of decision where you grow in the power of choice, suddenly people can actually harness that and develop their way of moving forward. Not to dwell on this again, but this is all based in systems theory and the Knafian framework used in business as a way of understanding business systems, but it works in human dynamics as well. Simple systems that just roll along in complete order where everything's predictable. Complicated, there are lots of different factors, but each one is logical. Complex, where all these factors are interacting with each other and making a system, a multiple interactive system that gets into a state with slightly unpredictable behavior or emergent behavior. And then sometimes those states get pushed into chaotic disorder, out of which new order can emerge by feedback learning. And that's what emotional logic does. So the conversations that emotional logic sets up move people from these chaotic states back into healthy complexity. A conversation between two people, they're each complex creatures, and they're discovering each other's worlds and feeding information backwards and forwards in a mutual process. That's a healthy complex state. The old style diagnostic model of mental illness and personality disorders, and very often things to do with relational systems and social systems, had a very linear processing concept of it. And the diagnostic model used a complicated set of criteria. Can I recognize this pattern? And then tried to move people to a simple state by introducing a protocol-driven therapy of some sort, or a guided therapy. So the two things work in different ways. Emotional logic tries to move people from chaotic to complex states. Diagnostic methods try to recognize complicated states, make them simple. Just to say that when people are in a chaotic overwhelm of emotional through losses, multiple losses all interacting with each other, whirlpools of emotion are a natural way that people try to move from that chaos into their own simplicity. But it's a maladaptive state, and it restricts behavior. And people, in order to re-engage, to come out of those states, need to re-engage first with their chaos and then move that chaos into a healthy complexity. That's the process. That's the theory of change that emotional logic is bringing in. Finally, 3 phases of an emotional logic conversation. Understand your emotional world, name the losses that are driving it, but then reinterpret those as a list of your personal values, and then make a values-based action plan. So ultimately, it's solution-focused. So although it's called emotional logic, it's not actually about the emotions. It's about the action plan. But what do you base the action plan upon? How can you recognize your values? Only if you recognize your losses. How do you know what the losses are? You've got to understand your emotional world and the emotional world of others in order to do that. So that's how the 3 fit together. Conversations are completely flexible and fluid once you understand this overall process. Safety and effectiveness. This is work done in general practice population. There's a lot to interpret, but the dotted lines, vertically and horizontal, are population averages, and these are the lower scale of normal. That's the lower scale of normal. Most people are up here to the right. Most people are up here above this line. Yeah. But emotional logic, the population of people in general practice who had common mental illnesses and relationship problems were scoring in this area here, but then they went up to these other areas. All of them, this is the no change line. The effect size of this is huge. It's a highly effective intervention, but the fact that no lines come below this natural error line means that it's a safe intervention. Nobody deteriorated significantly. But these blue dots are people who had a huge increase in their starting off here on an extremely low score, moving up to above this or up to these. These are the butterfly effects. People have a complete change of personal identity as a result of interpreting their loss emotions in a more constructive way not criticizing themselves, no longer feeling victims of their emotions, but active agents with their emotions, has vital information about your values, other people's values, and how you can act together to preserve a future built on those values. That's the theory of change. This is the safety and effectiveness of it. Finally, post-traumatic growth. So it's well known through the work of Fleetinander and others that a consistent, non-shaming relationship with an emotionally available adult is the foundation of making progress. Most methods of trauma informed training only talk about the neurology of this, the diagnostic features. And I have to say, I'm really quite worried about the way a lot of this is going, using the old Enlightenment science diagnostic model of a checklist of symptoms that is impersonal in order to diagnose a state called traumatization and then activate some sort of action plan. It's totally the wrong model, I'm afraid. Now, there are movements to try and say, no, lots of people know that there's something wrong, limited about trauma-informed training. And so they talk about trauma awareness or trauma sensitivity. But there, people using the Gottman model or the co-regulation model, where building that relationship simply needs to lead to an affirmation of the value and correctness of these of the emotions that are part of the traumatized state. And that's as far as it goes. It establishes relationship as important, but it doesn't add extra information into that relationship that can help the person to reinterpret their emotional world and their relationships and their values. This is what emotional logic adds in. All right, we're here now in the pragmatism side, and we've looked at the activist, the results side of what actually happens. Emotional logic leads to values-based exploration, and that takes over from the dominant narrative, which is emotion regulation. People are so concerned at the moment about regulating that behavioral outburst on encountering intense emotion. And it's led to this generalization that the overall purpose of this sort of calm, the effect of the Dan Siegel model is to regulate the emotion and bring about calming. That is only the first place that it starts. Within that calmer system, you need to build up a better understanding of the dynamics of how this led to traumatization and how people can harness their emotions into an exploration to move on to personal growth as a way through it. So we're teaching how that we can map that shock to growth cycle process, reinterpret shock and reinterpret depressive emptiness in more constructive ways that enable people to exercise their power of choice towards a solution focus. So emotional logic, once people get this method, we've discovered that it becomes incorporated into their whole way of approaching life. It isn't a tool that they just take out and activate when they encounter a new situation. It becomes a pervasive thing in looking at life and recognizing situations early in terms of the values that are being expressed in them. So conversations can very rapidly move from talk about feelings and behaviors. They shift rapidly to talking about values and action plans, which is a subtle but very significant shift. If you just talk about feelings and encourage people to talk about feelings, it actually can separate people. They don't know what to do about them. All they can do is try and regulate the behavior. But if you start talking about values, you've now got something to a purpose for the story. You've got a direction to life. That emotional energy has a meaning and it can be harnessed into a relationship. Then there's adaptability. So emotional logic becomes more than a tool. It's a mental framework to approach life. And people from any age, but this is taught in schools from the age of 5 upwards, they can generate more emotionally available people. Children in school are available to each other emotionally through learning emotional logic. And through this, they take it to their parents, and they get then to their neighbors, and then to the workplace. So there's a rolling wave of growing understanding about a way to reinterpret emotions in a more constructive way. And that is the main outcome that we're beginning to see happening from widely teaching emotional logic in different settings. So that's what I want to say. This is the background theory of change has moved on from an Enlightenment science attitude towards observation into a participatory state of a conversational engagement with people from the very first when you recognize there's a situation that's challenging values. Emotional logic equips people with a mental framework and the language to start the intervention immediately. There's no diagnostic process. There's no wait for a referral for therapy. You're in it straight away. You're part of the solution. That's the conversational truth of the new science, the systemic interaction that we're part of. So the Dan Siegel model of emotion regulated by the brain, good so far as it goes to help that instant, but it moves on to another one. So if the thumbs are your emotional world, then actually the emotional logic model is that two people meet through their pre-verbal communications, body language, tone of voice, facial expressions, as they're exchanging information subtly about what's important to them in the situation. And so the cerebral cortex, the understanding brain, becomes like people waving at each other and maybe sort of connecting intellectually, conversationally. That's the new model of emotional logic. And it leads on to personal growth, building order into our social settings, simultaneously with building inner order to our emotional worlds and our cognitive worlds. Thank you for listening.